You know?
Yeah, born and raised in Minnesota on a farm. And I consider myself a compassionate Lutheran youngster. Dad put me on a tractor when I was 11 years old. And he said, we went out to the field and he said, Lauren, you see that tree down there? I said, yep. And he said, well, aim for that tree and don't look back. Well, those words I still carry me today when I think about, when I look back to this. Well, the words of Jesus when he said, once you put your hand to the plow, don't look back. And yeah, I had a pony, and 2 dogs, and 3 brothers and a sister, and there was a situation. I was a senior in high school, and we were, a bunch of us guys. It was lunchtime, and we were gathered outside. Of course, some of my friends signed up. They joined after Pearl Harbor, but this was long about in April or May of '42. See, and I was going to graduate then in May, and Dad talked to me. I wanted to go too, but Dad talked to me. No, he said at least stay to high school, get your diploma in high school, and we were standing out there talking, Pastor, and this guy came up the sidewalk, and he looked to be about late 40s, early 50s, and he said, "I guess you guys are talking about the war, huh?" I said, "Yeah, you know, discussing." And he said, well, let me give you a piece of advice. And I said, you know, okay. He said, I realize that you're mostly farm boys, right? He said, yeah. He said, well, somebody's got to feed those soldiers. He said, so you can get an exemption and stay and help your dads on the farm and raise food for those. But he said, I realize if you received your summons, you're going to have to go. But he said, a word of advice, he said, don't volunteer. And I looked at him, I said, that's crazy. You know, I said, why? Because I was thinking about volunteering. I said, why not? And he turned away from me because I didn't think he heard me, you know. And I repeated. And Pastor, when he turned back to me, he had tears in his eyes, and he said, because you'll never be the same. He said, once you've been in combat, you'll never be the same. And he walked away. And of course, big me, I said to the guys, oh, that's silly. I'm me. I'll always be me. You know, this is me. This is who I am. Don't you believe it? Don't you believe it? So we knew we were going to the Marines even before we got out of the hospital. And I have to tell you this, Pastor, being a farm boy, and Dad put me on a tractor, and I took care of that tractor, and other machinery, you know, whatever needed to be done with the tractor. So in boot camp then, they filled out this thing, what are you best qualified for, you know. And I put out everything machinery, you know. Airplane mechanic, you know, diesel, you name it, that's me, you know. Whatever you need mechanically. I even volunteered for submarine duty. When I heard it was going to be a corpsman. A corpsman? What's that? What does he do? You know? And they said the casualty rate among corpsmen is so high that we need you over there now. You know, a corpsman's duties are twofold. Not only does he provide the primary medical care to take care of these wounded, but also he has to defend them. You know, when you get into a firefight, sometimes it goes both ways. In combat, that creeps up on you. And you see, I can't speak for others, but I think most of us have what we call peripheral vision. If you've ever looked at something and you said, oh God, I can no longer look at that, I have to turn aside. Well, this happens in combat too. And it happened on a number of occasions when I could no longer look straight at it and I turned aside. But the thing that you forget is that more equipped with peripheral vision, and that even though you turn aside, your peripheral vision is still taking pictures. And this is what your dream waves walk by you when you're trying to sleep. You see, your brain is searching for some impression. Not glorious impression, but something that impressed you. And it's, today they call it post-traumatic stress. Back then they called it shell shock. I take a look at a picture of myself on the day that I came back. And I look at that picture and I say, who's that guy? I don't know him. In this peaceful environment, Pastor, I realized that I had an identification problem. You see, one doesn't remove himself from the combat zone one day and try to pick up the pieces from where it all began the next day. That's just not possible. If the opposition of the enemy had not been so ingrained, then perhaps the transition would have been easier. And you see, at this point, forgiveness was not my forte. However, I realized that for all practical purposes, the word hate must have a target. And since my target no longer existed, then why the anger? Hath not the enemy surrendered? Didn't Japan sign this surrender document? I carried this burden around me for several years. And it was during this time that kind words from pastors and chaplains and concerned friends were most helpful to me in this regard. Still, when Jesus said, "Forgive your enemies," I convinced myself that he did not mean the combat type of forgiveness, especially when it referred to the inhumane tactics of a pagan enemy. They just didn't deserve my forgiveness. A good friend said to me, "Lauren, do you want to be right or do you want to get right? If you want to get right, then you're going to have to make some changes in your outlook in life, especially as it relates to forgiveness." And I consider that sound advice. This meant then that I would have to surrender my self-will to the Lord, and not to close my mind to beneficial suggestions. And also, I would have to surrender the right to myself and not insisting on being right all the time. And remember that try to remember that the greatest act of revenge is forgiveness. But this would require, on my part, unconditional surrender. And I thought about that. Years pass. During this time, I tried to forget, but forgive? No way. I did not know it at the time, Pastor, but my path and your path were about to cross. And I refer to September 15, 2005. I call it my red letter day. It was on that date during your sermon when you said the very words that I wanted to hear as it related to forgiveness. May I quote this sentence for the benefit of everyone who may also be struggling? Here it is. A forgiven memory is not a forgotten memory, but rather it is a healed memory. And then I'd like to repeat that. A forgiven memory is not forgotten, but is healed. The battle for me now is finally over, and there may be scar tissue, but nevertheless the wound is healed. And it was at this time that I thought about Jesus when they used that spear on him. You know, he carries with him that scar, but it's healed. You see, throughout this entire ordeal, I was I was permitting the unforgiven hatred of the enemy to live rent-free in my heart, mind, and soul. Pastor Rico, I gladly wrote this lengthy discourse to show just how far down you had to extend your reach in order to pull me up to the level to which you could administer gospel CPR. And in this context, Pastor, if I may, in the words of my progenitors, that is, in the words of my forefathers, may I say, Manga Tusen Tak. Many thousand thanks. Well, the words of Jesus when he said, once you put your hand to the plow, don't look back.